this time, Bishop Sutton is going to come and do our first plenary session. He is the rector of Church of the Holy Communion, the co-adjutor of the REC, Diocese of Mid-America, and now the Vice President of the Reformed Episcopal Church. We welcome Bishop Sutton.
Thank all of you, and again, welcome. I typically do the first talk to sort of set the topic for the conference. This year, our theme is the Inklings, and I'm delighted to begin with this topic. One of the great privileges of my whole life was the opportunity to go and study at Oxford. And one of the very first things I did was go to Busey House and join the Oxford Society, in which I eventually met the son of C.S. Lewis and Joy. I heard him speak at the C.S. Lewis Society and learned firsthand about this amazing group that so influenced the world. This PowerPoint can be made available to you. We'll talk about if you'd like for us to email it so that you can download it. So just see Father Casey and Kathy about that. The Inklings, the Oxford Inklings. It all begins in that mysterious medieval world of Oxford, circa 1920s and 30s. This is not part of the PowerPoint. So if you attempt to download this, don't do it. Let me try this. Wait for the technology to catch up.
Right.
Okay, it all begins with this amazing world in the 1920s and 30s, Oxford, England. And Oxford is kind of a magical place. When you go there, you feel like you're stepping back into the Middle Ages, because in some sense, you always are. But late one evening, in a conversation lasting to 3 a.m. in the morning of September 19, 1931, what's called Addison's Walk behind Magdalen College, Oxford. This college in Cambridge is called Magdalen College. And there's a really important philosophical, theological reason why Magdalen College is called Magdalen College in Cambridge. You know what it is? Because Cambridge and Oxford hate each other. So it has to be called Magdalen College. 3 Oxford dons, Oxford Don is a professor or a teacher, were strolling Addison's Walk together on this evening. They were C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Henry Victor Dyson, of whom we'll talk about a little bit more later. It was a fascinating inkling of the group. But that night, these 3 were walking along Addison's Walk. Lewis was struggling with the relationship between imagination and reason. He had become a theist by this point, but he was struggling with the relationship between imagination and reason. In particular, he wrestled with Christian symbols, as he said, like the resurrection, which already tells you something about how he was struggling. Is the resurrection a symbol, or is it reality? That was his issue. The issue was the historicity of the story, the legend, the tale. Can symbol be historical or true? Does story with symbol need to be deconstructed to find historicity and veracity? Which, you know, is what the deconstructionists are committed to. They see a disjunction between symbol and reality. Well, not necessarily do these have to be separated. Hans Frey, his Eclipse of Biblical Narrative, Reverend Childs, and the Yale hermeneutical movement, particularly Frey, in his Eclipse of Biblical Narrative, talks about what the Enlightenment did in separating history from symbol. And argues that the Christian faith does not separate history from symbol, reality from symbol. You start separating history from symbol, and we get a separation of reality and symbol. And he says, that is not the historic Christian position. And he argues for what he calls a pre-Enlightenment world and life view, which didn't separate reality from symbol. Lewis had joined Tolkien's The Coal-Biters Society in the 1920s, which Tolkien was a major leader. Coal-biter referred to the group having to sit so close to the fire, they almost had to bite the coals. That was their name. The group was dedicated to reading Icelandic and Norse sagas, Beowulf and Beer sessions, eventually morphing into the Inklings. It progressed beyond Beowulf, but it still involved beer. But on that night, Lewis told Tolkien in 1931 on Addison's Walk, at about 1 a.m. in the morning, he said to Tolkien, myths are lies. And Tolkien responded, myths are not lies. Lewis explained in some detail in a letter to Arthur Greaves, quote, October 1931, now what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this. Tolkien explained the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with tremendous difference that it really happened. That was the statement that Tolkien presented to Lewis. Tolkien showed Lewis how the two sides could be reconciled in the gospel narratives. The Gospels had all the qualities of great human storytelling, but they portrayed a true event. God, the storyteller, entered into his own story in the flesh and brought a joyous conclusion from a tragic situation. Suddenly, Lewis could see that the nourishment he had always received from the great myths and fantasy stories was a taste of that greatest, truest story of the life, death, and the resurrection of Christ. And of course, that continues to be a theme in Lewis's writings. That all of the great tales of humanity are but a shadow of the greatest and the truest tale, the gospel. From this period on, Lewis believed in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, the veracity of the resurrection. And eventually, Lewis would influence Tolkien in other ways. It would sort of come back around. The unpayable debt that I owe to him was not influence, but sheer encouragement. Tolkien wrote decades later, he was for long my only audience. In fact, that eventually becomes a part of a tension that grows between these two great friends, which we'll talk about in a moment. And thus began one of the most important and influential Christian and literary relationships of the 20th century. Tolkien, Tollers, as Lewis called him, would eventually call Lewis every man's theologian. When The Lord of the Rings was published, Lewis said of it, this book is like lightning from a clear sky. It represents the conquest of new territory. In a letter to a friend, Lewis hoped the book, quote, would inaugurate a new age. In some sense, in the literary, certainly the Christian literary world, it did. And I think it is larger than just what has happened in the Christian world. So who were the Inklings, a rather large group of people, most of whom you've probably never heard about. Properly speaking, wrote Warren Lewis, C.S. Lewis's older brother, the Inklings was neither a club nor a literary society, but partook of the nature of both. There were no rules, officers, agendas, or formal elections. And yet how could this, as Tolkien would coin a phrase for us, how could this fellowship of the chalice have so much influence? Well, of course, C.S. Lewis, you know him, professor of medieval literature, author primarily of children's literature, perhaps the reason why he was not awarded a Regius Chair in Oxford, and in the 1950s was awarded a chair at Magdalen College, which, by the way, was a college in Cambridge where I did all my research, and he finished out his career and his life. J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature and history, a philologist. Charles Williams was a literary critic who worked for Oxford University Press, was really the theologian of the group. A profound man who died prematurely in 1945 as a young middle-aged man. Left us 7 fantasies and a slew of theological essays that are absolutely amazing. Owen Barfield was a British philosopher and poet. Christopher Tolkien was the 3rd son of J.R.R. Tolkien, professor of English language at Oxford. Warren Lewis was the older brother of C.S. Lewis, a British officer and somewhat amateur writer, as he would sometimes describe himself. Roger Lancelot Green was a children's writer, one of many children's stories. Adam Fox was canon and dean of divinity at Magdalen College, Oxford. Hugo Dyson was a committed Christian and academic. Tolkien later said, although our habit was to read aloud compositions of various kinds and lengths, and sometimes they would read to each other all day long at one pub, cross the street, and continue reading into the night at another pub. This association, its habit, would in fact have come into being at that time, whether the original short-lived club had ever existed or not. In some sense, he's touching on the fact that in the middle of the 20th century, there was a Christian revival of some sort that began in England and spread to America. Well, continuing with the list, Robert Havard was the physician of C.S. Lewis and his wife, and a very loyal and faithful Inkling. J.W. Bennett was a literary scholar. Lord David Cecil was professor of rhetoric and English literature. And Neville Coghill was a theatrical producer. Came to probably greatest of fame when he produced the Broadway musical Canterbury Tales, which won a Tony Award in 1968. When we look at this group, it was amazingly diverse in terms of literary and academic skills. And that in itself was a great strength. They would meet on Tuesdays at the Eagle and Child, sometimes nicknamed the Bird and Baby. And they would go all day, many times, until the Eagle and Child closed. And then they would go across the street to the Lamb and Flag and continue into the evening. So in the Eagle and Child, it says that Eagle and Child takes its name from the motifs of the crest of the Earls of Derby. The pub, which has stood here since 1650, is a favorite with Oxford academics and writers. You know, in Oxford, there are the gown pubs and there are the town pubs. And I learned very quickly that as a member of the Gown Society, never go into a town pub. You might not come out with all your limbs. And favorite with the Oxford academics writers, J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, were once regulars. They were part of a literary group called the Inklings, referred to the pub, bird, and baby. Here's another plaque hanging. The Eagle and Child, Oxford, the Inklings, until 1963, the great writers of the Inklings, C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and others met regularly on this spot. Well, not Williams, because he died in 1945. The conversations that have taken place here have profoundly influenced the development of 20th century English literature. C.S. Lewis, his brother W.H. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and other friends met every Tuesday morning between the years 1939 through 62 in the back room of their favorite pub. These men, popularly known as the Inklings, met here to drink beer and to discuss, among other things, the books they were writing. And I like this one. I think this one's actually in the Lamb and Flag. You know these characters, Pippin, Merry from the Lord of the Rings. Pippin, what's that? Merry, this, my friend, is a pint. A pint of ale. Pippin, it comes in pints. I'm getting one. The four most widely recognized of the Inklings were, of course, Charles Williams, Tolkien, Lewis, Owen Barfield. We can narrow that down further to the three that most of us know something about. Here you see on your far left, Tolkien, in the middle, Lewis, and Charles Williams. But this afternoon, I think we want to focus on Tolkien and Lewis and the world view that they advocated. We could do a somewhat overview of every one of the Inklings, but I think to set the stage for what you're going to learn in the next few days, let's concentrate on Tolkien and Lewis, for they surely did shape the society that we know of as the Inklings. There are many similarities between Tolkien and Lewis, explaining the draw of friendship. And they were great friends. They became best of friends before they drifted apart from each other. Well, they were both what are called outlanders, products of the empire in its day of autumnal glow. Tolkien was from South Africa, where his father was a banker, and Lewis was a Belfast Anglo-Irishman growing up in Northern Ireland. He saw England, they both saw England as home, but they were really outlanders outside of England itself. But earlier years they spent as the colonials, outlanders. Both lost parents, especially mothers, very early. Lewis at 10, and Tolkien was an orphan, literally. The latter was placed under the guardianship of a local Roman Catholic priest, who apparently was a great man of God. Both were products of the era of British decline, around the beginning of the last century, where the British Empire basically came to an end. From the beginning of the last century through World War II. They, however, fought as officers in the First World War, distinguished themselves heroically. Although Tolkien was quite sickly, he became ill, some sort of virus going around. Of course, you know that the Great Flu epidemic hit the world about this time. Maybe some say perhaps it was the flu. But both witnessed in World War I, because they were there on the front in Europe, in some of the most hideous battles of World War I. If you know anything about that war, it was devastating. England lost 1 million men in World War I. And they, as one writer said, they witnessed indescribable carnage, which Norman Cantor, the medievalist, says explains the imaginative taste for violence in both of these writers. I mean, they can describe a battle like no other. I mean, think of the Lord of the Rings, all of the battle scenes, great detail. Think of C.S. Lewis, the great battle scene at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and others. The similarities continued. On one occasion in World War I read somewhere, C.S. Lewis was responsible for capturing 80 Germans on one occasion. So these guys, Lewis and Tolkien, they, in one sense, kind of broke the mold of what you see as your typical Oxford don, right? Kind of an egghead academic. Why is it doing that? I'm not doing anything, Father Casey. He's going to ask me, what did you do? I didn't do anything. Well, the similarities continue. We'll try to get our screen back here. Scholars both were medievalists in some sense and fond of the old European northern and southern tales. And I'm just going to kind of keep going. You can get the PowerPoints later on as they come up. Both writers mostly wrote fiction, especially fantasy and science fiction. And if you think about the time in which they lived, science fiction was somewhat of a new genre for that period. Jules Verne had been doing it, in the 19th century, but science fiction, think of how it's come on as a genre. It comes on in the 20th century. Both wrote science fiction. Lewis was probably a better science fiction writer than Tolkien, and Tolkien kind of decried that. C.S. Lewis had his adult science fiction. Tolkien wrote an adult science fiction, but it never came off very well. Both were committed Christians. Tolkien a Roman Catholic and Lewis an Anglican. And we're losing our screen here. Both became apologists for Christianity. Tolkien more indirectly and Lewis more directly. And we begin to see kind of somewhat the philosophical difference in strategy. Part of it has to do with personality, which we'll come to in a moment. C.S. Lewis gave those famous talks on the BBC radio during World War II that became a book called Mere Christianity. He Screwtape Letters, Pilgrim's Regrets, which is his most philosophical of his apologetical works. They both figured out the tale, particularly science fiction and fantasy, could be used to present a Christian world and life view. They dipped deeply into the well of a Scottish minister and author named George MacDonald, who had lived in the 19th century. And in particular, the old European medieval Catholic Christian world and life view expressed in those tales. Both have the most profound understanding of evil since Augustine and Dante, though they differed on their views of talking about Satan. Think of all that these men wrote about evil. I mean, you could basically say Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, Screwtape Letters are the most amazing commentary on evil in one sense. They knew evil. Lewis knew evil particularly well because, as he said somewhere, he had lived on the other side. He knew what was going on with the occult at a great university like Oxford, which we're now learning more and more about how the occult was spreading across Europe in the early part of the 20th century, even in intellectual and academic communities. I mean, I can remember when I was a college student reading somewhere that Adolf Hitler was involved in the occult and that Winston Churchill had actually gone to a war room meeting and said, we need to understand that this man is involved in the occult. And they practically laughed Winston Churchill out of the room. Nobody believed him. And it said that Churchill never ever again brought it up. And I remember even when I was in college bringing that up, and it was just kind of sloughed off. But in the last 20 years, we have indeed discovered what was going on inside the Third Reich and the leadership of the Third Reich. They were deeply involved in the occult and had created a dark, dark society of blood oaths and sacrifice. And, to quote Ray Bradbury, something that wicked that way comes. So these men had a profound understanding of evil and are invaluable in helping modern humanity that prides itself in thinking that it is not quite as bad as everybody else. That's the problem, one of the problems of Western culture. We don't think we're quite as bad as others while we live on the precipice of extraordinary evil. Well, but like all true good friendships, they can pass through ups and downs, even in troubling times. Even though two can be similar, the differences can accentuate to the point of conflict. I mean, the New Testament spells conflict in the church early on. Remember why the order of deacon was formed by the apostles? It was because two women's groups were at odds with each other. Two groups of widows were at odds with each other. And perhaps portending what we would continue to face all through church history, that those who are close can sometimes end up very much at odds with each other. Maybe that's why the New Testament describes a church that is not perfect and pristine, but a church that must learn how to live through its ups and downs. One of my professors used to say, if you think you found the perfect church, don't go to it, you'll ruin it. So even though two can be similar, the differences can accentuate to the point of conflict. Well, Lewis was a very outgoing personality. He was gregarious, easygoing. Tolkien was introverted, shy, liked to be off by himself. Lewis was from the wealthy side of the middle class, not the nobility or the very, very rich, but he was from a somewhat wealthy family background. Tolkien was from a very, very poor background. Tolkien was Roman Catholic. Lewis was Anglican. Tolkien never understood why Lewis did not convert to Rome, why he persisted in remaining Anglican, and really wanted Lewis to become Roman, but Lewis was decidedly Anglican. Tolkien had a long, happy marriage with many wonderful children. Lewis spent most of his life as a bachelor. They differed on their writing approaches, as we'll talk in a moment. They bickered back and forth on how to use symbol and literature, and Tolkien didn't like it that Lewis loved allegory. Tolkien hated allegory. you know. And he would always get burned up when people were writing and telling what he was really talking about in Lord of the Rings, when in fact he wasn't, you know. In fact, that's the weird thing about the 20th century. Have you ever noticed this? Authors aren't allowed to tell you what their symbolism really means. Somebody else has to tell you. Well, that just kind of goes with kind of the incoherence of the age. So Tolkien liked the tale that presented another world with a basic message. Tolkien didn't like allegory, but used more general symbolism of a world to offer his message. His quasi-hero, Frodo in Lord of the Rings, says to Sam, quote, "I tried to save the Shire. It has been saved, but not for me. It must be often to be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. But you are my heir, and you will read things out of the Red Book, and keep alive the memory of the age that is gone, so that people will remember the great danger," capitals, "and so love their beloved land all the more." Well, differences and similarities can sometimes produce rifts between the best of friends. And there was a rift between Lewis and Tolkien. But sometimes, you know, God, the Holy Spirit, uses rifts, like Paul and Barnabas. The gospel spread in extraordinary ways because those two men didn't continue to travel with each other. And hence, I think we should expect to see that through church history, sometimes Paul and Barnabas will stop walking with each other for a while, and out of that will come great spread of the gospel. But the rest of the story is that Paul and Barnabas came back together. And we need to come back together. Tolkien wrote in 1964, this is a year after C.S. Lewis's death, "We saw less and less of one another after he came under the dominant influence of Charles Williams." There you have it. Williams was an allegorist. If you've read his Seven Fantasies, whopping good. Descended to hell and so forth. But Tolkien really probably didn't like Williams all that much. And then he continues this, and still less after his very strange marriage, which was to Joy David Gresham. However, out of that marriage came some of Lewis's greatest insight into suffering. Because he had written a book about suffering before he lived through a marriage to a woman who died right before his eyes of cancer. And to see what he says after he had lived through the suffering, about suffering, is like night and day. But Tolkien could never understand this marriage. Didn't approve it. Didn't like it. But God used it. The rift between Lewis and Tolkien, like that conversation between Frodo and Sam at the end of the Lord of the Rings. Frodo chooses to leave Sam behind in the Shire and sail on with Bilbo, Gandalf, and the elves to the Undying Lands. So now that I've told you about the rift, maybe you'll look at this conversation a little differently that's in the Lord of the Rings. It goes like this. "But," said Sam, and tears started in his eyes, "I thought we were going to enjoy the Shire, too, for years and years, after all you have done." Frodo replies, "So I thought to once, but I have been too deeply hurt, Sam." But after Lewis's death, Tolkien wrote to his daughter Priscilla that Jack's, that was what Tolkien called Lewis, Jack's passing, quote, "feels like an axe blow near the roots." They loved each other dearly as close friends, and yet, in the latter part of their lives and careers, these two great stalwarts of the Inklings did not see as much of each other and drifted apart. But let's talk about, in the remaining time, about the last half of this introductory lecture, let's talk about the world and life view, what's really going on in the Chronicles of Narnia with C.S. Lewis and the Lord of the Rings with J.R.R. Tolkien. Focusing on Lewis and Tolkien, they told stories that presented a pre-Enlightenment world and life view because they saw modernity and the approach of postmodernity as containing the seeds of what once was and therefore so similar to the conflict of neo-pagan and Christian in the Middle Ages. I mean, I've heard some people talk about the Middle Ages, and it became, in many senses, a high water mark of Christianity and culture in the West. But we should not think that the Middle Ages were this idyllic period that lasted from roughly circa AD 500 to the time of the Reformation and beyond. I would really say the Middle Ages continue until the Enlightenment. The Reformation and what followed is really part of the Middle Ages and the medieval world and life view. But that's something we can talk about another time, maybe. But the Middle Ages was an incredible time of conflict between Christianity and neo-paganism. It's just that Christianity won to a great extent. And Lewis and Tolkien saw that. They saw the Middle Ages as a time, 1,000 years span, give or take a couple hundred years, when a great conflict took place in the West, and Christianity and the church emerged. Norman Cantor has a book called Inventing the Middle Ages. He says the medieval culture is both different from ours and very much in communication with ours, Lewis believed. In this way, there is an ambiguous, tinsel, stretching, and creative relationship between medieval heritage, literature, and art, and our own way of thinking and seeing. This has never happened before since we put this equipment in. We think something else might be going on here. So bear with us as technology brings us low. So I think what I'm going to do is get out of the PowerPoint. And you'll just have to bear with me. As I continue the lecture. Lewis observed of the medieval, the modern, postmodern tendency is to perceive that, quote, in every way, if we have not outgrown, we have at least grown away from the romance of the rose, which was a French romantic masterpiece of the 13th century. Lewis wrote an amazing work that was published a year after his death in 1964. And if you want to read what he was really trying to communicate in his writings, you want to pick up the book, The Discarded Image. He says, Lewis observes that to think we have outgrown the medieval worldview would be superficial. Humanity does not pass through, this is a very important observation, humanity does not pass through phases as a train passes through stations. That's really not how history works. Because history is alive. Being alive It has the privilege of always moving, yet never leaving something behind. Whatever we have been, in some sort, we are still. Let me repeat that. Lewis writes, whatever we have been, in some sense, we still are. So for Lewis and Tolkien, they believe that as Christians who have passed through the Middle Ages and the medieval church in the West, in some sense, that's who we still are. We've not discarded it. If only we can see that we still are Christians bearing those seeds with us. It says, neither the form nor the sentiment of this old poetry has passed away without leaving indelible traces on our mind. Lewis and Tolkien, however, figured out that if we use the tale, and particularly science fiction and fantasy, we can communicate this worldview. Now, part of it was, even in 20th century England, in the academic world, there was so much hostility to Christianity growing. In pre-World War II, academic communities in Britain, that Tolkien, and especially Lewis said, maybe I can communicate this world and life view, this Christian world and life view, if I set it in terms of science fiction. I can get people reading about another world only to discover that I'm talking about this world. Chaucer said the great old stories in his Troilus and Cressida, quote, aim to make dreams truth and fables history. Chaucer, from Canterbury Tales in the High Middle Ages, thought the great old stories aim to make dreams truth and fables history. So Lewis writes in 1947, quote, that something which the educated receive from poetry can reach the masses in stories of adventure almost in no other way. So they were taking the great poetry that the educated would spend enough time to try to understand, because poetry makes you labor. You have to, this is a culture. Where's the great poetry? Hardly anybody's patient enough to understand poetry. Because with poetry you have to meditate. Somebody said, it's emotion put to verse. It draws you in. You have to think about it. You have to read it 50 times to understand it. Well, what would you expect if a human gives you a great wisdom insight? It's kind of like Proverbs. Proverbs is aphoristic poetry. And we could talk about what's going on redemptive historically with this corpus of literature in the Old Testament. But very significantly, that when Messiah, Jesus, comes, how does he preach? He preaches like Solomon. Why don't we preach that way? Lewis and Tolkien got this. That's why they saw the power of the story, the tale. And that was the way to communicate to the masses. They'll always listen to a good story. Hollywood forgets that sometimes. Hollywood, is going through a rather difficult time because they become so dependent on technology, they've forgotten. It doesn't make any difference what technology you've got. If you don't have a good story, it's lousy. People like a good story. And the greatest stories in the history of the world come from heaven. And Tolkien and Lewis got it. In particular, Lewis, Tolkien, and Williams offered a medieval world and life view. For Lewis, the quest for the Middle Ages was the pursuit of, quote, the compulsive imagination of a larger, brighter, bitterer, more dangerous world than ours. Do you think of the Middle Ages as a more dangerous world than ours? I hope in a few minutes you might have a rethink. See it as it was a much more dangerous world than ours, even though ours is coming closer and closer to all of the elements of medieval Europe. Lewis gave lectures at Oxford and Cambridge on he had this fantastic, I wish I could have heard it, wish it had been recorded. But the title of his lecture series was The Medieval Imagination. Now in his book, The Discarded Image, he talks a lot about that. He wrote, quote, "The medieval imagination is not a transforming imagination like Wordsworth's." Wordsworth and the Romantics wrote about the transforming power within nature. And Lewis goes on, or the penetrative imagination